Hello there, and welcome back to our 1930s Oscar retrospective. If you watched the last video, we talked about the first few Best Picture winners of the 30s, All Quiet on the Western Front, Cimarron, Grand Hotel, Cavalcade, and, as you can see here, It Happened One Night. So let's pick up and see what 1935 through 1939 held for their Best Picture winners. So, last time we talked about It Happened One Night, we mentioned it was with starring Clark Gable, and the first sort of true blue straight comedy to win Best Picture. So keeping on the subject of Clark Gable, our winner for 1935, Mutiny on the Bounty, the story of the ship, the HMS Bounty, how it traveled to Tahiti, and the crew overthrew the tyrannical Captain William Bligh. So Gable stars as Fletcher Christian, head of the mutineers, tired of all of Bligh's strict discipline and his over-the-top punishments and whatnot. I think it's one of the last films Gable made without a mustache. You can see a little strange there. In a lot of his earlier 30s films, like A Free Soul, he doesn't have it yet, but I guess apparently Royal Navy sailors at the time were not allowed to have mustaches, so Gable had to shave it off again, even though his image had changed so that he always had one. And we also have Franchot Tone as kind of a young sailor starting out, a midshipman, I believe. And then the absolute star of the picture, I think the main reason to watch it, Charles Laughton as Captain Bligh himself. He gets all the classic lines, you know, "You mutinous dog." Make sure that stays in there. And "Keel haul this man," and all that famous stuff. He does a fantastic job, completely upstaging the rest of the cast. Clark Gable later said this was his favorite film of his own, or at least he considered it his best film, even though he didn't get along with Charles Laughton, which probably helped their character interactions, nor did he get along with Franchot Tone. I think the main reason to watch Mutiny on the Bounty today, too, is to see all those great British character actors. We have, like, Donald Crisp is in there, Dudley Diggs, all kinds of stuff. Or not all British, too. We have, like, Ian Wolfe and Eddie Quillen in there as well. But some really effective scenes. The mutiny itself is very well done. It plays kind of fast and loose with history, of course. I think of all the adaptations, tends to be regarded as one of the least accurate. It wasn't the first adaptation of the story, nor was it the last. Famously, of course, there's the one from the 1960s with Marlon Brando. And here's a 2 VHS set of the 1980s version starring Mel Gibson with Anthony Hopkins as Captain Bligh, which apparently this one is supposed to be much more historically accurate. In the end of the day, if you like old swashbuckler stories, you'll get a lot out of Mutiny on the Bounty. It's kind of forgotten today, but a strong cast and some very effective scenes. You know, the mutiny itself is really well done. There's a very effective visual of a bayonet sticking through Ian Wolfe's hand. And some strong performances, especially by Charles Laughton, who had already won an Oscar a couple years prior for playing Henry VIII. He didn't win the Oscar this year. Actually, even though Gable, Franchot Tone, and Laughton were all nominated for Best Actor, Victor McLaglen took the prize for The Informer, which we'll be talking about next week for St. Patrick's Day. But anyway, this is a good one. Kind of unjustly forgotten, but definitely worth your time. One that might not be worth your time, The Great Ziegfeld, the winner for 1936. The story of Florenz Ziegfeld, here played by William Powell, his rise to fame, his various difficulties and whatnot. The Great Ziegfeld is over 3 hours long, and it's a musical. Now, there are other long musicals that have won Best Picture, notably Oliver and My Fair Lady, and I get a lot out of both of those movies, but The Great Ziegfeld is just too long. It feels like it's spinning its wheels most of the time. The most famous scene, of course, is the giant song and dance number, A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody. Dennis Morgan plays the singer, but I think it's actually Alan Jones's voice, which further adds a disconnect, some really bad 1930s dubbing. Louise Reiner won her first Oscar here for playing Ziegfeld's first wife, Alana Held, but she's not really very good, and she's not in the movie that much. You know, it's much more of a supporting part. And Myrna Loy, who played opposite William Powell in many, many, many movies, including the Thin Man stuff, is in this too as Billie Burke, his second wife. and she's much better, but again, she really isn't given that much to do. There are some good kind of character bits here. We do see some actual actors who appeared in the Ziegfeld stage shows in real life, like Ray Bolger and Fanny Brice appear as themselves, and that's really cool. We have some decent impersonators there of Eddie Cantor, and a pretty good one of Will Rogers. But at the end of the day, The Great Ziegfeld, it doesn't bring a lot to the table. It's definitely the kind of film that 1930s audiences would have eaten up, but by today's standards, it feels slow, it feels outdated. You know, those musical review films were very big in the early sound days, and they'd come back off and on throughout the next decade or two. But at the end of the day, it's just tedious by today's standards. It certainly has its moments, but not a favorite of mine, nor a favorite of many other people's. This tends to rank near the bottom of most people's Best Picture winner lists, and well, I don't think it would be at the very bottom for me. It's probably in the bottom 20 or so. I don't know. It's got some good ideas, and again, William Powell can do no wrong, but yeah, there's many better films to check out with him. Not one I have that much to say about. I've only watched it a few times, and it doesn't do much for me. One I have much more to say about is the Best Picture winner for 1937, The Life of Émile Zola, starring Paul Muni as the famous French writer Émile Zola, that kind of thing. Now, the film itself does kind of focus on Zola's life, but only a little bit, like his famous novel Nana. They talk about why he wrote that and that kind of thing. His life as kind of a struggling artist in Paris, but the bulk of the film is focused on the Dreyfuss Affair, of him going against the French government and the French military to try to save this army officer who'd been basically railroaded into prison, and even the French high command knows that he didn't deserve it, but they needed a scapegoat, so they just kind of grabbed him because he was Jewish. Something the film touches on a little bit, but doesn't go too far into. But he, needless to say, writes many books and makes many pleas to various French officials, and it does end with a happy ending. Again, like with Mutiny on the Bounty, history, kind of thrown out the window in a few spots. It's not exactly accurate, particularly details regarding Zola's death and the aftermath of the Dreyfuss Affair, that kind of thing. And there are many other films about the Dreyfuss Affair as well. Now, this film stars Paul Muni, and we've talked a little bit about Paul Muni before. Today he's probably best remembered for playing the lead in the original Scarface back in 1932. His Italian gangster Tony Camonte, of course the influence for Tony Montana, the Cuban gangster, would come much later. Scarface is a very good film. I can't recommend it enough. And he'd pop up in many other important dramas, like here is I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, also from 1932. Very good movie, definitely worth seeing. Deal with prison reform. And he's most remembered today for his biopics. There's even a joke in an episode of MASH where Hawkeye says, yeah, Paul Muni played everybody. So, Benito Juarez, Louis Pasteur, all kinds of different historical figures. He's pretty good as Zola, but, I mean, he does go off the rails a few times. Paul Muni's very hammy and tends to be kind of an acquired taste. When he has to play a larger-than-life character, he's really good, but his role as Zola is really uneven, and frankly, I think is one of the least interesting parts of the movie. Joseph Schildkraut, who is in my favorite Christmas movie of all time, The Shop Around the Corner, and in a couple Twilight Zone episodes, he pops up playing Dreyfuss, the man who was wrongfully imprisoned, and he's very good in it, so much so he won an Oscar. He has a lot of more like expressive moments where he doesn't speak, he just relies on his face and his body language, and he's quite good in those. A good contrast to Muni, who's going berserk the whole time and yelling his lines and whatnot. But the real reason to watch The Life of Émile Zola is to see all these great old-fashioned character actors like Harry Davenport, Ralph Morgan, Louis Calhern, Robert Warwick, Robert Barrett. All of them play these really scummy, completely just immoral French high command officers who are trying to save their own butts, so they, and make sure an innocent man is imprisoned, and make sure that no one can possibly figure out what really happened. And their comeuppance at the end of the movie, when new officials take over, is very rewarding as well. But that's the biggest joy I get out of watching it, seeing all these actors. Some chew the scenery, some don't, but they have really good chemistry together, and you really get the idea that there's this cabal that's out to protect their good names and nothing else, and I like that a lot, and I think that's the main reason to watch Life of Émile Zola. It's a good film, not a great film. Most people put it near the middle of their Oscar rankings. I think that's very fair. You know, it could have done with maybe a little more pomp and circumstance, but at the end of the day, it is a rewarding watch. And while Muni's pretty uneven, the rest of the cast is quite strong. So we talked about It Happened One Night in the last video, and that was of course directed by Frank Capra. Today when we think of Frank Capra, we think of It's a Wonderful Life, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, maybe Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. But his other Best Picture winner, no, it's not Arsenic and Old Lace, was 1938's You Can't Take It With You. And this tends to be one of Capra's most forgotten films. Do you know Polly Wolly Doodle? You will after watching this film. So, You Can't Take It With You is a comedy, much like It Happened One Night was. And yes, harmonicas do play an important role in it. That's why I've just briefly played mine for you. But this one being the story about a family that kind of doesn't play by the rules, that they're all their own people, they're very free-spirited and whatnot. And what happens when the girl, played by Jean Arthur, falls in love with the son of an important business tycoon. They're played by Jimmy Stewart. A big ensemble cast, Misha Auer, Spring Byington, all kinds of different character actors and actresses, all of whom are obviously having a lot of fun playing these different parts. And there are some really wacky scenes involving fireworks, and my all-time favorite part, when the rich society mother of Jimmy Stewart's thrown into jail, and she used to share her cell with all these streetwalkers. That's my favorite part of the movie. But, you know, definitely some interesting stuff going on here. You know, it's weird in that it's very anti-establishment, which is odd for a 1930s comedy. Not unheard of. Others, like Holiday, dealt with similar themes. But it does feel definitely very free-spirited. I don't know that it makes for a very memorable Best Picture, because it doesn't break a lot of new ground in my eyes either. It's not something that really sticks in your memory that well, and it's one of the Capra films I don't revisit very often. But a great cast, some good gags, and something you can honestly have a lot of fun with. So Capra got the first two regular comedies, not musical comedies or anything like that, to win Best Picture, and that's really nice. And they're similar but not the same, and you can have a lot of fun with both of them. And lastly, our final one, the Best Picture winner for 1939. You probably know it already. Do 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 do. Gone with the Wind. I decided to show my VHS copy off instead. Now, Gone with the Wind has come under a lot of scrutiny in the past few years, mostly because it deals with a pre-Civil War and immediate post-Civil War South. So we're looking at the Civil War from a Southern perspective, slavery factors into the story, all that kind of stuff. And admittedly, Gone with the Wind handles this better than some previous films had, like Birth of a Nation is always the one everyone compares this to, but Gone with the Wind is a lot better than Birth of a Nation when it comes to being empathetic, when it comes to not playing into stereotypes as much. Now, it still does. Characters like Prissy are still very problematic, even though she gets one of the most famous lines in the whole film with, "I don't know nothing about birth and babies," that kind of thing. But I enjoy Gone with the Wind. It remains, I believe, the longest Best Picture winner. It's not the longest nominee. I think that's still Cleopatra. But I don't think a longer film has actually won. Gone with the Wind is every bit a big-budget, old-fashioned Hollywood spectacle. It's photographed beautifully. I would argue it's one of the prettiest films to look at. It has a very strong cast. Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh have great chemistry. You wouldn't think of Vivien Leigh as a Southern belle, and they did age up Scarlett O'Hara a little bit to make Vivien Leigh more believable, but she is quite good in that part. Gable sadly didn't win Best Actor again. That went to Robert Donat in one of my favorite movies, Goodbye Mr. Chips. But he is still excellent. They have great chemistry, as do the rest of the cast. Olivia de Havilland is in there too. She does a nice job. Leslie Howard, nearing the end of his life and career, appears too. It's such a great film, and if you can look past some of the more problematic aspects of it, in terms of the depictions of various types of characters and kind of the politics of the immediate post-Civil War South, It is very enjoyable. I will say, compared to the book, it tones down a lot of that stuff, like the KKK presence, all that stuff is kind of pushed so far into the back that you can't even really see it anymore. And characters like Mammy, Hattie McDaniel, becoming the first African American to win an Oscar, actually have moments that are surprisingly progressive, where Clark Gable's Rhett Butler says how Mammy's respect is worth having more than anyone else's because you have to earn hers. That kind of thing. So if she likes you, you know you're doing something right. And that's good. I like that. And she and Gable have really good chemistry as well. You know, if you can look past some of that stuff, if you can appreciate it for the artistry and the beauty, I think you can really enjoy Gone with the Wind. I think it's aged quite well. It's not quite in my top 10 best pictures, but probably in my top 15 or 20, I would say. And a movie that, well, it might be best if you split it into 2 or 3 pieces. Certainly very enjoyable. And kind of one of those relics of a bygone movie-making day. And of course, there was a sequel book written decades later. Margaret Mitchell's only novel was Gone with the Wind. So someone else wrote the follow-up, Scarlet. I forget who. I read Scarlet years ago. I don't really remember it very well, but here's the 2 VHS set of the sequel with Timothy Dalton as Rhett Butler. Who knew James Bond would become a Southern gentleman? Well, there is that one John Gardner novel where James Bond stays in a replication of the Terra house from this film, so who knows. Alright, and that does it for the Best Picture winners of the 30s. Let's see what the next Best Picture that will be added to the list of films is at the next Oscar ceremony, and we'll see you next week as we look at films about Ireland for St. Patrick's Day.